Welcome back to Free Speech Nation. Citizens are being jailed for offensive riot-related social media posts. And these are very tough sentences, one of which was for over 3 years. So joining us to discuss this now, I have the editor of Spiked Online, Tom Slater. Tom, welcome to the show. Now, a lot of people will say that this is all just hysteria, nothing really is happening, there's nothing to worry about here. Can you give us some examples of what's been going on?
No, absolutely. So it's worth saying that the online offences are a pretty small proportion of the 600 or so charges that have been brought so far. It's about 5% from what the police have been saying. And also the vast majority of those tend to relate to people allegedly kind of inciting violence in one form or another. That's a very fraught territory in terms of how to define that.
Yes.
But at the same time, there are these other examples which I think aren't really being talked about nearly as much, which are really to do with expressing opinions or lying or pushing misinformation on the internet. So there's one case in Carlisle where a gentleman had essentially shared a series of racist memes. He's been given 8 weeks in prison as a consequence of that. There is, of course, the case of Bernadette Spoforth, who people might have been had already heard about this case, where because she is believed to be one of the people who was originally pushing the misinformation about the Southport killer being a Muslim asylum seeker, she was arrested and now bailed on this new kind of false communications offence that we have under the Online Safety Act. And there's actually been a case last week which has completely gone under the radar, which was a 25-year-old gentleman in Derby who has been now convicted of that false communications offence because he made basically a video on TikTok pretending to run away from a far-right mob. So he was just attention-seeking to about 700 TikTok followers. He's been given about 3 months in prison. So I understand that a lot of the cases people are seeing are people, cheering on, if not encouraging rioting. But there are some much more clear-cut cases of free speech being abridged, even if it is offensive, unpleasant speech, that no one seems to want to talk about.
Well, the second example you gave there is an interesting one, because did she not say something like, if it is true, then this is the identity of this person is an asylum seeker, etc. Yeah. When we get, and there was another case, wasn't there, of someone who's been in prison for putting something that struck me as an unpleasant thing to say with an emoji of a gun next to an emoji of an ethnic minority person. Not a very horrible thing, I don't approve of that kind of thing, but got prison time again. So we are dealing with existing laws being used, but a disproportionate kind of approach to actually lock people up for their free speech, aren't we?
Absolutely, and I think in those cases that you just mentioned and in the cases that we've already been talking about, this is a kind of clear-cut issue as far as free speech supporters are concerned. It doesn't matter how offensive these views are, it doesn't matter how spurious some of the claims are. You do not want the state to be involved in the business of defining and punishing what is hate, nor working out what is true and punishing people for pushing falsehoods. That takes you into very Orwellian territory. But there's a tremendous complacency about the laws that we already have, the way in which they're being used in the wake of the riots, and lack of appreciation that things like this set precedents that will be used again. And so whilst these might not be people who are particularly easy to defend in terms of what they're saying, you definitely do have to defend their rights for all of us.
And to what extent is this feeding into the perception that there is two-tier policing, two-tier justice system going on? Because we had the Nick Lowles, was it, from Hope Not Hate, putting out complete misinformation, putting out a tweet suggesting that Muslim women were being subjected to acid attacks. Completely false, completely untrue, created a lot of fear within Muslim communities, which seemed needless stirring up of fear and hatred. Why is he not being arrested?
Absolutely, and then that's
not that he should be, by the way, but why is he not being arrested?
Well, I think we all know why, because there is unfortunately a disparity in terms of how some of these things are punished. Now, it's worth saying that in some of the examples we've talked about, some individuals were seen to be kind of egging on or influencing the rioters. In some cases, it was that gentleman on TikTok who was kind of pretending to be a victim of the rioters. So this does go all round to a certain extent. But I think it's definitely true that people who are kind of more in the kind of respectable public eye, if they accidentally share a bit of misinformation and apologise for it, it's kind of no harm done. But when a member of the public does it, or someone who isn't as favoured, shall we say, it becomes a big problem. And I think that this road that we're going down, particularly when it comes to misinformation, is such a brave new world for UK state censorship. We've had all kinds of hate speech laws and even some kind of other false communications laws on the books previously, but this new one and the way it's being used, I mean, if we're going to lock people up for being fantasists on TikTok, we're going to need a lot more prisons. I mean, it's a crazy thing that we're getting.
Well, a lot of the judges in their sentencing are saying that they are doing this to set an example to other people, which explains the disproportionate sentencing. But that strikes me as a bit of a dangerous precedent again, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, it's not to say that it's completely without precedent insofar as we saw this in the wake of the London riots in 2011. And I think when you talk about really disproportionate sentences, it is also worth talking about some of those cases of people seeming to revel in or kind of incite violence and so on. Because in each of those cases, there's always going to be a very difficult argument as to how was this intentional? Was this, if it's to 12 people on Facebook, that's different to shouting in front of a mob. But just taking as read that some punishment needs to be meted out. In some cases, you've got people being given 3 years in prison, and there was when they were just someone who was engaging in some vile attention seeking on Twitter or such like, to a few hundred followers. It's not. So I think that's something that we have seen before. In 2011, there were young men who were given 4 years in prison for calling for a riot that never actually took place. This thing has happened before. I think that was something that people should be concerned about, as people should be concerned about what's going on right now. But,
my understanding is that the bar for incitement to violence in the UK has always been very high. And it strikes me that a lot of these tweets clearly don't meet the normal threshold, the normal criteria for incitement to violence. Has there been a relaxation of what is counted as incitement to violence?
Well, it's very hard to tell, and it's interesting because sometimes if you look at the actual charges that have been brought against them, what they actually end up being prosecuted on, it's often incitement to racial hatred as well, which is a more ambiguous standard. It's one that's slightly more straightforward to meet. But you're right, incitement, regardless of where the law is currently, I think that if you're going to have free speech, incitement, of course, is not free speech. There's no civilised country in the world who would allow for that. It's not a matter of speech. It's a matter of kind of being engaged in and egging on violence. But at the same time, you need to define that very, very tightly. In America, for instance, obviously land of the First Amendment, it means speech which is intended and likely to cause imminent lawless action.
That's the Brandenburg test.
Absolutely. And that's something that I think is worth bearing in mind, because it's not to say that we should go lightly on people who are, see something, the horror in Southport, and instantly start talking darkly on social media about burning mosques. This is disgusting behaviour by any stretch of the imagination. But we do have to be careful about getting into a situation where a moment of kind of bigoted madness lands someone in prison for 3 years. Is that proportionate to the crime that we're talking about? And also because there is so much slippage these days between incitement to violence, incitement to hatred, we're quite confused as a country as to what these standards mean.
And what would you say?
Lead to a bad situation, I think.
But what would you say to a critic of yours who might say, well, look, all of these people who've been locked up, they strike me as wrong-uns. They're saying really horrible things. What's wrong with just locking? It's not like decent people are being locked away. Why does it matter?
Well, I think that really hits at the heart of this. And if we were talking specifically about people who aren't inciting violence, which, as we've already established, should be a crime, people who are just expressing bigoted, racist opinions.
Yeah, what's wrong with locking them up?
I think that really gets to the heart of this, because on the one hand, it's not obvious to me at all that censorship is how you deal with these trends in society, these bigotries. I mean, everyone says, well, you need hate speech laws because otherwise the Nazis will come back. Infamously, Weimar Germany had hate speech laws, and every Nazi propagandist you can think of were criminalised under that, and they used it as a propaganda exercise. They used to do cartoons of Hitler with tape over his mouth. Yeah. So this is a bad road to go down if we want to tackle the underlying prejudices. But also, if you really think that hate speech laws are only ever going to be limited to actual haters, as we all might roughly understand it, I've got news for you. But it's already happening, that people who hold actually quite common sense views, gender-critical feminists, for example, have had not just a visit from the police, but they've actually been convictions, thankfully overturned later on, under the sort of legislation that we're talking about.
Well, this is to do with the slippage of language, isn't it? I mean, a lot of people are being branded as far-right. We've seen in the riots, I think, definitely some elements of far-right behaviour. Some people who have been charged multiple times in the past for similar thuggish kind of behaviour, and you see these people opportunistically jumping on this. But there's also a lot of people being branded far-right, and everyone being thrown together as far-right, when clearly, I'd actually say in the majority of cases, it's not accurate. So isn't that a worry as well?
I think it is. It's also not helpful for trying to understand what these riots were as well, because as you said, there was quite clearly far-right and racist elements, absolutely. But actually one of the more chilling things about it was that this was a kind of more not particularly organised, not centralised upsurge in racist violence, effectively. It was incredibly chilling, and it was of a nature that we haven't seen before, something which does have a lot to do with how the hard right operates now. It's something which is more of a kind of network social media phenomenon. So even if we're just trying to understand what this was, how we can challenge it, how we can tackle it in a liberal way, then throwing labels around and also trying to demonise people who have just, had views on immigration, multiculturalism, whatever, I think that gets us into entirely the wrong space. And also, it's another kind of intolerance. I mean, people aren't just going around saying people who incite violence should be locked up, as we all agree. They're going around saying that Elon Musk should be extradited to the UK to stand trial, that these are the Farage riots because his own campaigning on the migration questions or whatever fanned the flames of what we saw in Southport or Hartlepool or whatever. It's quite obvious that the disgusting racism of the few is being used as a kind of pretext to demonise quite a lot of people, potentially even silence them, and that's something we've got to be very sensitive to, I think.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for joining us, Tom Slater. Really appreciate it.